I used to hold on to a quiet belief. If he cared, he would ask. I waited for that question more than I realized. Days passed in small routines. He spoke, but never about what stayed inside me. I kept noticing what was missing, not what was there. Slowly, I started forming my own conclusions. Maybe he didn't really care. Or maybe he simply didn't want to know. I kept everything to myself. The worries, the small passing thoughts, they stayed quiet, just like me. Then something shifted in me. Maybe this was never about him asking. Maybe I was the one who never really opened the door. My name is Clara. I've gotten used to holding things in, especially the heavier thoughts. It feels easier that way, even if it lingers longer. The day felt ordinary. I sat at the dining table, looking over the same numbers again. They seemed familiar, yet heavier than before. I could tell something wasn't right, but I didn't say it out loud. I kept turning it over quietly in my head. He came home late that evening. He looked tired, more than usual. I chose to stay quiet and let the moment pass. We sat down to eat together. The conversation stayed light and simple. It almost felt like everything was fine. I found myself waiting. Just a small question would have been enough, something to open the door. But he didn't ask anything, and I didn't begin either. We stayed quiet, just in different ways. The night ended like it always does. Calm on the surface, nothing unusual to notice, but inside it felt full and unresolved. I started noticing this pattern in small moments. It didn't feel urgent at first, just quietly familiar. But it kept repeating in ways I couldn't ignore. Whenever something important came up, I kept it to myself. I would think it through quietly, as if that was enough. Sharing it never felt like the first option. I always had reasons ready in my mind. He must be tired, I told myself. Maybe later would be better. Over time, something shifted without me noticing. The silence grew more present than the conversations. Even when we were in the same room, I began to feel unheard, though I hadn't said anything. That part felt strange when I admitted it. The quiet was something I helped create. I wanted him to understand without explanation. I hoped he would notice what I never showed. It felt easier than opening everything. Maybe that expectation was never realistic. But I held on to it without questioning. It quietly stayed with me. Eventually, I felt tired in a quiet way. Not from what happened, but from what never did. And I carried it alone for too long. I sat again with the same notebook. The numbers looked familiar, but still unsettled me. Nothing had shifted, even after days of thinking. I paused and looked toward the living room. He was there, as usual, in his own space. It felt close, but somehow distant. I wanted to say something. The words were already forming quietly in my mind, but they stayed there, unfinished. A familiar doubt came back again. What if he didn't understand what I meant? What if the response felt cold? My hand almost closed the notebook. It would have been easier to stay quiet again. That had always been my pattern. But this time, something felt heavier. Not dramatic, just harder to ignore. As if staying silent was no longer enough. I stood up without rushing. Each step felt small, but intentional. I moved toward the living room. For once, I didn't wait. I didn't look for the right moment. I simply began to speak. I sat at the table, holding my thoughts carefully. Saying it out loud felt unfamiliar, almost fragile. It was a small sentence, but it carried more than I expected. He looked at me, not with confusion, but with quiet surprise. It wasn't the topic that caught him off guard. It was me choosing to speak first. I didn't explain everything the way I usually do in my head. I just shared a piece of what I felt. It felt simpler, but more honest. He didn't interrupt or rush to fix anything. He stayed still, listening in a way I hadn't noticed before. The silence felt different this time. Something shifted in me as I sat there. I realized I had been waiting for a response, without ever creating space for it to exist. I had been hoping he would ask questions, but I never opened the door for those questions to come. I kept everything quietly contained. Maybe he wasn't distant the way I thought. Maybe he simply didn't know where to begin, and I had mistaken that silence. I never showed him that I needed to be heard. Not clearly, not in a way he could understand. And maybe that mattered more than I realized. Since that night, I tried something different. Not a big change, just a small shift in how I respond. I allowed myself to be a little more honest than usual. I didn't try to say everything at once. Long explanations felt unnecessary. I started with small things that felt easier to share. When I felt worried, I said it quietly. Not perfectly, not completely. Just enough to let it exist outside my head. When something confused me, I didn't keep it for too long. I chose to share it before it grew heavier. Even if the words felt simple, it didn't always feel comfortable. Sometimes I still hesitated. There were moments I almost chose silence again. Still, I kept going. Not forcing anything, just allowing the process. Step by step, it became less unfamiliar. Slowly, conversations started to appear. Not planned, not forced. They just happened in between ordinary moments. It wasn't because he suddenly changed. Nothing dramatic really happened. I simply stopped, closing myself off. I used to believe communication had to feel equal from the start. It had to come from both sides at the same time. Otherwise, it didn't feel right to me. Now I see it a little differently. Sometimes someone simply has to begin, and that doesn't make it wrong. It's not about being stronger than the other person. It's about noticing things sooner inside yourself. That quiet awareness changes something. I can't expect him to understand what I never say. Thoughts don't travel on their own, and silence doesn't explain anything. I also don't want to keep feeling alone in the same space, especially when I choose not to speak. That silence becomes mine too. Maybe communication isn't about proving who's right. It feels more like choosing to open something small, even if it's quiet and simple. Opening up doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't need long explanations. Sometimes a few honest words are enough. In the end, it doesn't need to be big. It just needs to feel real, just enough to begin something different. I began to notice how silence can stretch longer than intended. It sits quietly between routines, unnoticed at first. Over time, it starts to feel like distance. I used to think he would notice on his own, that he would ask if something felt off. But not everything is visible from the outside. I carried expectations without saying them out loud. They stayed in my mind, repeating quietly. And somehow, they became heavier over time. Opening up didn't come naturally to me. It felt unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable at first, but I started to see it differently. It takes courage to say simple things, to admit what we feel without preparing it perfectly, to let ourselves be seen as we are. I know I don't always get it right. There are still moments I hesitate, but I'm learning, little by little. Something changed when I stopped holding everything inside. Not all at once, but enough to feel different. I didn't feel alone in it anymore. Things didn't suddenly become perfect, but they felt lighter in a way I hadn't noticed before, and that was enough for now. That night felt quieter than usual, even though nothing had really changed. We sat a little longer at the table, letting the moment stretch. It wasn't about solving anything, just staying there together. Something small shifted in the air, almost easy to miss. Words started to come, not perfectly, but honestly. The silence that used to sit between us felt a little lighter. For the first time in a while, my thoughts didn't feel so crowded. I didn't have to carry everything quietly inside anymore. There was space, and I could finally breathe in it. Maybe he didn't ask because I never really opened the door. I had been waiting without showing what was inside. Realizing that felt simple, but it changed how I saw us. Now I see things a little differently. Not all at once, but enough. The waiting feels quieter, less heavy than before. And somehow, that feels like a beginning.